These are the texts from the Common Lectionary that will be used in churches that use the Common Lectionary on Sunday, June the 9th this year. There's a sort of a strain of thought that I think goes through all of them. I don't know that I'll put it together as effectively as you might when you look at the text, but I'm going to give it a go. The first text comes from 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, and a little more than just the 8th chapter. What's being attempted here in 1 Samuel is to show all of those areas to where the kingship that the people are requesting is not so positive. And so they come to Samuel to ask for a king, quote, like the other nations. And then Samuel begins to warn them all about why that's not a good idea. Samuel takes a lot of this personally as well, and actually our text starts out rather personally. The people come to Samuel and they say, you know, your two sons don't follow in your path, so give us a king like the other nations to rule over us. First off, there's something similar there, is there not, with the word that came to Samuel when he was a little boy about Eli and Eli's sons. That Eli's sons, of course, the text says they were wicked and evil, but in this case, we don't know exactly why the boys aren't following in the way of Samuel exactly. But clearly it disturbs the elders of the people enough that they come. Now, think about Samuel for just a minute. Samuel has served as the priest, as the prophet, as the judge. I mean, he is the man. And now something is going on and the people want a change. Now, it could be that Samuel, being older now, is just not working out for him as it did, and he has less vigor, although his vigor is going to go on. He has two kings he's still going to anoint, the first one being Saul and then the second one being David sometime later. So we can assume that it isn't just about age, that there is a desire on the part of the people to be more like other nations. The text is going to warn, or Samuel's going to warn in our text today about that. And he's going to say things like, look, the king's going to tax you. He's going to take your sons and put them in the army. He's going to take many of your daughters and make them housemaids for the royalty that will gather around him. In other words, you put a king on top of you, and all of a sudden, instead of the freedoms you have enjoyed, you're going to be restricted. Of course, every government is restricting in some way, and we require governments in order to help us to coordinate our efforts in some kind of a unity, which sort of hints at the disunity happening in our own country today. And there's disunity that's occurring in this time of the request of the king. So Samuel here in chapters 8 and also again in chapter 11, the kingship is looked at in a very negative light. But to turn to chapter 9 and 9 through 10, 16, and I think chapter 11 as well, you're going to see that the kingship is viewed in a much more positive light. So we've got these two conflicting views. Samuel thinks that they're rejecting the Lord as king. God says to Samuel, Samuel, they actually are rejecting me as king. They're not rejecting you, so don't get your feelings too hurt. They are rejecting me. But then there are these elements here that talk about what a good thing the kingship is going to be. And of course, all of us into the modern day kind of look at David, the second king, as some kind of a wonderful biblical figure, even though he clearly has his deep flaws. So I think that the power of this text for us is to help us to see the genuine, let's call it ambivalence, or you can call it conflict, between viewpoints about government. boy, are we embroiled in that kind of a thing today. And here we see, even in the early days of the people of God, that is also an issue. The psalm is Psalm 138, and what's fascinating about this psalm of thanksgiving, we don't exactly know what he's thankful for. Most Thanksgiving psalms, well, there's a couple of things about it. Most Thanksgiving psalms, the Thanksgiving comes after the people feel as though they, or a person feels as though he or she has been rescued from some horrible thing, from an enemy, from disease, from some other kind of destruction. But this one, we really don't know exactly what the issue was, except down in verse 3, on the day I called you, you answered me and increased my strength of soul. That's all we know. The other thing that makes this Thanksgiving psalm different, most all, if not all, I can't think of one that's not this way. So let's just assume that this is the only one like that right this minute. Most of the Psalms are addressed to their fellow worshipers. So, oh, give thanks to the Lord who rescued me. The Lord is wonderful. The Lord is steadfast, and so forth. In this one, the entire thing is directed to the Lord. It's not a bad thing, obviously. But the hint about this then becomes, it is likely the psalm delivered by a king, perhaps David, but maybe a later king. There are many authorities think this psalm actually came a little later than David. But it is delivered by a king and addressed directly to the Lord. My favorite part of this, which to me is a recognition on the part of the king that any and all good things that have been done for the sake of the Lord. The very last half of the last verse, which is verse 8, do not forsake the work of your hands. In other words, the king is aware that any of the good that brings about this thanksgiving in his heart is a direct result of the good work of God on behalf of the king or with the king's own efforts. I think you can go either way, or maybe it's intended to go both ways with that thought. I'll go to the letter from Paul today first. I was about to go to Mark first instead, but I think I'll use that one last. The text from 1 Corinthians today is a sort of continuation of the text from, 2 Corinthians. It's a sort of a continuation of last week's vessels of clay, where Paul was defending himself and acknowledging that even though he seeks to proclaim the gospel and to be a living witness to the gospel, as in imitate me, was Paul's acknowledgement last week that we are vessels of clay. In other words, we're not pure, we're not perfect. And so even when we say things, the words may not come out well, or we may not have the gifts of oratory to deliver them well or to write them well, and we may not even have the physical efforts in our work to do the thing just exactly in a perfect way. We are vessels of clay. And so this picks up on that theme in a way, and speaks about the spirit of faith. The intention of the faith is to keep us going, is to energize us, and beyond energizing us, this spirit of faith is a gentle reminder that everything going on now is not the perfect state that God intends. There is a better state and a better day coming in the eternal weight of glory, let's say, which is beyond all measure. So that is what sustains Paul, is not his confidence in the words he delivers, in the physical expressions of his faith. What gives Paul confidence is that his faith persists, and in eternity, everything about his faith and ours will be made perfect. As our current nature fades away, our vessels of clay fade away, then all in our faith will be made perfect. I hope you can see already how this connects with the ambivalence in the book of Samuel, not particularly today's text, but how I shared with you also the text where the kingship is seen in a positive light. Humans are always going to be in conflict. We're not always going to see things eyeball to eyeball. In what's gone on this past week in a courthouse in New York, there are those that celebrate and cheer the result, and there are those that are completely and deeply concerned, and it goes beyond just politics. I've been very interested in Alan Dershowitz, who by his own admission has voted for the current president in the past, and is by his own admission a liberal Democrat who is gravely concerned about what's gone on in the courthouse this past week. There are others who think that everything was brilliantly done. So again, this human conflict, because we are vessels of clay. And now the conflict continues in the Gospel of Mark. Let me find Mark here. I take real delight in this section of Mark. It really covers a couple of stories. Oh, well, here's a little fun fact, though. At least I think it's a fun fact. I hope you will, too. Beelzebul, ending B-U-L. I hope I said that well enough for you. Beelzebul is a Syrian god, and for the Jews, Beelzebul becomes synonymous with Satan. But there was also a play on that name that other Jews used as well, and it became, and you may have heard it this way, Beelzebub. Instead of B-U-L at the end, it becomes B-U-B. So, whereas Beelzebul was this Syrian god, a little pagan god that the Hebrew people considered a sort of a personification of Satan. They also used it as a play on words to poke fun at Satan, and Beelzebub means literally Lord of the Flies. So Beelzebul literally means Lord of the House for the Syrians, you know, the little god that you post somewhere and go worship, a false god. And Beelzebub was Lord of the Flies. I think that's a pretty neat little thing. And so you may want to look through some other texts, because it is Beelzebub elsewhere in the New Testament. Now, beyond that, into what we are reading today, the religious authorities are thinking that Jesus' ability to do miraculous things comes from Satan, comes from Beelzebul. And Jesus just responds by saying, no, wait just a minute. Would Satan harm the works of Satan? That makes no sense. So that where there is goodness and joy and people's lives are restored, that is just completely contrary to the works of Satan. Now that story right there, with the religious authorities concerned that Jesus may be evil, is right next to the story where Jesus' mother and brothers come to him. They can't quite get to him because where Jesus' teaching is so crowded, and so they send word in. And the whole hint here is that his mama and his brothers think that Jesus is crazy. So look at what we've got here. We've got the religious authorities who have led the people for centuries, thinking Jesus is evil. We have Jesus' own flesh and blood family thinking that he's crazy. And then we have all of these other people sitting at his feet who are overwhelmed by the presence of God that they find in the person of Jesus. Jesus, being a flesh and blood human, in his own way is a vessel of clay. And so to some, he seems evil. To others, his own family, he seems nuts. And to still others, they see beyond that vessel of clay into the purity of what God has created in Jesus the Christ. I think to sum up, it's pretty easy to see, is it not, that humanity is a mixed bag. We always will be a mixed bag. Even the psalm delivered by a king recognizes that it is the hand of God that delivers the good works in the person of the king and not anything the king does on his own. And we see in these other texts the genuine conflict of what it means to be a human being. I'm thankful for the words of Paul, who knows that what persists in our faith is not the purity and not the clarity that we're going to come to any day this side of eternity. But purity and clarity, we believe by faith, is the promise of God in the eternity that God has planned for us. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.